Tak dobrý den, já bych vás ráda přivítala na festivalu Knihex. Děkujeme moc Holešovické tržnici, že nás tady nechala. A zároveň bych chtěla poděkovat kasárnám Karlín za to, že tak akčně tady nám připravili bar a děkujeme. Zároveň teda teď bych vás chtěla pozvat krom tady programu ještě na dětský program, což budou převážně dílny, ale nejsou jenom pro děti. První dílna začíná teď v 11 hodin a je od nakladatelství Lví kámen. Bude se věnovat kreativnímu storytellingu a výtvarnému workshopu pro děti i dospělé. A teď už začne debata nakladatelství Alarm, platformy Alarm a povede ji šéfredaktor Alarmu Jan Bělíček s Niccem Srnickem a bude o knize Až skončí práce, Dějiny, domácnosti a boje za volný čas, což je první překladová kniha Alarmu, pokud jsem to dobře chytla. Tak děkuju moc.
Mikrofon nebo ne? Jo? Až moc možná. Děkuji za uvítání, ještě budu pokračovat v češtině chvíli. Je to první překladová kniha, jsme rádi, že tady Nickem Srnickem je, ale chtěl bych říct, že my budeme spolu mluvit anglicky, takže doufám, že to nevadí, nemáme tady nikoho na překlad a já to nebudu dělat takovou tu věc, že budu česky opakovat to, co řekl Nick, tak doufám, že to bude v pohodě pro všechny přítomné i lidi, kteří nás sledují online. To je jenom tak na úvod jsem chtěl říct. Teď switchnu do angličtiny. Welcome everyone who came to this debate with Nickem Srnickem, one of the authors of the book After Work, A History of the Home and the Fight for Free Time. Nickem Srnickem is a writer, scholar. He teaches at the King's College London. And he's the author of the books like Inventing the Future, together with Alexem Williamsem, and Platform Capitalism. He's an expert on digital economy, platform capitalism, and the concepts of post-works and post-capitalist society. And it's a big pleasure to have Nick here with us in Prague. So, Nick, welcome here.
Thank you.
We are here to discuss the book After Work, as I said before, which is just fresh from print. So you can see it here maybe for the first time. We have the stand just behind this building, or how to call this thing. And you can buy it there on nakladatelství Alarm stand, but you have to come alone today or to visit Prague. Can you tell us, there's no Helen Hester, there are no kids, which is a shame, because the domestic labor and care are the main topics of this book we're going to talk about. So can you tell us why are you here without them? Just briefly.
Yeah, good question. So basically, we've got 3 children. One of them is in school, and in the UK, you just can't get kids out of school for trips like this. So inevitably, one of us has to stay home. Helen got to go to Milan and Barcelona a couple months ago, and it's my turn to go to Prague now. So, yeah, we switch it up.
Yeah, originally we invited all of you, but as Nick described, just him could come to Prague. As for your book, After Work, it is a sophisticated, thoughtful critique of, let's say, concept of a contemporary nuclear family, but also of how care is distributed in society. We will talk about all this later on. But the whole process of creating this book was also interesting, wasn't it? Could you say something more about that? When did you and Helen start writing this book, and when was it finished, and why? Because it's important for the topic as well.
Yeah, we Helen started writing this, I think in 2015 or 16. It was originally a talk that she gave, and then as I was sort of reading it over, I was like, "This is great. We should turn it into something bigger." So it's a book about the family from the origin, from the beginning, and then we had 3 children and started having our own family over the course of writing the project. So it was supposed to be done, I think, in 2018, but we had 3 kids, and it took us 5 years extra to write it. So. We got some practical experience of domestic labor in the process.
Yeah. You are known mainly for your books that I mentioned earlier, Inventing the Future, Platform Capitalism, and maybe for your theory of left accelerationism, let's say. How does all this relate to your new book, After Work?
I think one of the core ways in which they're all sort of related, particularly the sort of accelerationist strand, is the emphasis on using technology, using the material infrastructure that we have, in order to move beyond capitalism to something which allows a lot more human freedom than what is currently available. That's continued through Inventing the Future. Platform capitalism, in many ways, was looking at the challenges facing this sort of project. Who controls technology today? And then After Work is sort of a continuation of Inventing the Future, sort of focused on a different set of labor. So most post-work thinkers have focused on wage labor, typically looking at sort of masculinized labor, things like factory jobs or office jobs or something like that. But what gets left out is all of the sort of feminized labor, typically done in the home, but increasingly done by wage laborers as well. So After Work is basically saying, well, post-work needs to look at this type of work as well.
So that was the main motivation to write this book, that something is lacking in all these theories. We were talking about housework, post-work society, but we're not talking about the fight for free time. Can you elaborate what free time is for you? Why is it important? And, how is it related to all these, things that we discussed already?
Yeah, so in the subtitle of the book, we have The Fight for Free Time. And in many ways, this sort of slogan of the fight for free time came about because of the reactions we got to Inventing the Future. So Alex and I would go and do talks about Inventing the Future afterwards, and invariably in these talks, somebody would come up afterwards and say, well, why do you want to end work? Like, I like work. And so this, the fight to end work always caused these sort of issues of like, well, this is what we mean by work, this isn't what we mean, blah, blah, blah. The fight for free time gets to the same sort of thing, but I think it really puts the emphasis on not necessarily ending sort of purposeful, intensive effort, but instead giving people the choice, the autonomy to be able to choose things, to choose how they spend their time, which is ultimately what free time is all about. So it isn't, a distinction between, say, work and just like lazing about doing nothing. Instead, it's a distinction between work, which is determined by capitalism and your boss and managers, and work which is chosen by you and actively determined by you. So this is what the fight for free time is all about.
If we can talk a little bit about the care in the contemporary society, what would you say are the worst aspects of the current distribution of care in our societies?
I mean, they remain vastly unequal in terms of gender. It has gotten better over the past 40 or 50 years in most countries. Women are doing, on average, less domestic labor, less care work, and men have started to do a little bit more on average as well. But there's still pretty significant differences between the genders. I'll give one example, which is in the UK. The official stats say that men have about 5 more hours per week of free time than women, and it's simply because of the domestic labor difference, the gender division of labor there. So there's that sort of quantity aspect of like who is doing more work, but then there's also the quality aspect. So studies have repeatedly shown, for instance, that the quality of free time that men and women have is very, very different. Men have free time where they're unburdened by childcare. They don't have to, they can just sort of focus on themselves and whatever they're doing. Whereas women tend to, if they're a parent, they tend to have to look after the child as well while they're ostensibly having free time. So their quality quality of free time is always with like half an eye on the child running around and making sure they're not hurting themselves. So the quality of free time is very different as well between genders.
Mm-hmm. There's a fascinating stat in the book from the 70s, I would say, that said that people spend almost as much time on domestic labor than as they did in 1870. So nothing has really changed during the last 100 years. How is it even possible, despite all the various technological innovations and all that? How is it possible that the domestic labor is pretty much the same?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of surprising things that emerged in the 1970s. These researchers started looking at how much work was being done in the home, particularly because in the early 1900s, there was this massive revolution in the home. You started getting, electricity, plumbing, gas lines. You started getting washers and dryers, dishwashers, stoves, fridges, freezers, all these sorts of devices which are supposed to save time, supposed to save labor. And the expectation would be that somebody who was doing domestic labor in the early 1900s, it would be very different in the 1970s. When researchers went and actually looked at the numbers, though, what they found was that people were doing the same amount of domestic work, that there'd been virtually no change in the amount of work people were doing, despite all of this new technology coming into the home. Part of what we do in our book is to continue that line of sort of analysis, and we bring it up to date today. And there's research showing today, for instance, that basically over the course of the 20th century, we're doing as much domestic labor as we were at the start of the 20th century. 100 years of no change in the amount of work that we've been doing, despite all the changes in society and technology and things like that. It's called Cohen's paradox after Ruth Swartz Cohen, who was the major one who looked at this work. I don't know if you want me to go into why this is the case.
Yeah. Why?
Yeah, but why? There's a couple of reasons why that Cohen picked out. One of them was that a lot of sort of domestic labor before these technologies had been quite communal. So laundry, for instance, was often done by sort of a neighborhood group of women who would get together, once every few weeks or something to do these massive loads of laundry. It was communal labor. Then when you get a washer and a dryer, suddenly that work can be done by an individual, and it turns from being collectively shared labor to individualized labor, particularly in the form of like a housewife. The other core reason why there's more work is because as the sort of effort to do this stuff goes down, the expectations of it go up. So Cohen, for instance, notes that as we get all these technologies which make cleaning the house much easier, there's also rising expectations about how clean your house is supposed to be, or how clean your clothes are supposed to be. Laundry was like something you would do every few weeks beforehand. And now if you have 3 children, you're doing laundry just continuously. In my house, we're doing 1 to 2 loads almost every single day to get all these clothes clean. And it's a set of rising standards. There's no necessary reason why we're doing laundry this much, but it's this rising social expectations that have caused more work to be produced.
Maybe when we're talking about reducing the amount of domestic labor, we are talking too much about technologies. What made it? Is there anything else that has an impact on this? Not the inventions, technologies, but a different approach maybe to doing these things. You were talking about, let's making these things more communally and more organized. But what are the other, let's say, angles to this?
Yeah, in the book, we sort of look at 4 different aspects. One is technologies, which is sort of, whenever you're talking about how do we end work, technology always figures quite prominently in, because you just say, well, robots will do the work. With reproductive labor, it's difficult for all the reasons I've just sort of talked about, but also because we don't necessarily want robots to be raising our children. Although that being said, so many parents do put their children in front of TVs and effectively let TVs raise their children in many ways. So there's that sort of aspect. Then there's the standards thing. So the rising sort of set of expectations around domestic labor, which is, cleaning and, that sort of stuff. But also recently it's been parenting has been the really major rise in expectations. So one of the really curious things we found in our research was that actually we're parenting much more than we ever have before. In the vast majority of rich countries, parents are spending more time on children than ever before. And this is pretty surprising, I think, because at the same time as this, time spent on parenting has been increasing, we've had women moving into the workforce more and more. So we have less time spent at home, more time spent in the workplace, and yet we're still spending more time on children than ever before. And the basic reason why is because of capitalism. That's just a short answer. But the core reason is because you want your kid to have a good life. To get a good life, they have to get a good job. To get a good job, they have to get a good education. To get a good education, they have to compete with every other little child. And suddenly you get this incentive, this imperative to be teaching your children from, even before they're out of the womb. You're supposed to be playing a Mozart and things like this. So there's all these forms of intensive parenting that have arisen. The other things we talk about, though, are the family and the house. So technology, standards, the family, and the house.
And you said this phenomenon of intensive parenting is related to inequalities. Can you say something more about this, like how these two relate?
Yeah, so the research on intensive parenting, they found that it's correlated with the inequality levels of a country. So the more unequal a country is, the more likely it is to have intensive parenting in that country. And you can sort of guess why, because if you're more unequal, you have to fight that much harder to get your children into these few places that are in the elite. So yeah, it all stems from, capitalism and inequality and everything like that.
When we are talking about family parenting and all that, we have to mention Sophie Louis' book, Abolish Family. You're mentioning it in a book several times. What made it so crucial for you? Do you also think that the family should be abolished?
Yeah, it's a very polemical idea of family abolition. I love Sophie's work. I think she's brilliant, and I think her writing is amazing. I think the one major difference we have, in the book at least with her, is just on the terminology. So when you call to abolish the family, if you're not sort of immersed in the ideas of what that means, it might appear as though, the state's going to come along and say, you can't live as a family, we're going to take your children away from you, and all these sorts of, crazy ideas. Family abolition doesn't mean that. And so in the book, we choose a different term. We talk about communal care as a sort of alternative to sort of the provision of care solely through the family. We want to expand the possibilities of care being provided.
Do you think the aim is the same? Like Sophie Louis and yours? Like just a different wording?
I think it's very similar, yeah. I think probably she's a bit more against the family than we are. But we're both very interested in producing these alternatives and massively alleviating the sort of stresses that are placed on the family for providing care. As a parent, you're supposed to be an educator for your children. You're supposed to be a therapist for your children. You're supposed to be a friend, a tutor, a disciplinarian, all these sort of different roles that you're supposed to play for your children. And it's a lot of work, It's a ton of work to raise a child. And there's no reason that we have to, limit it just to the parents within a home providing this sort of stuff.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what's problematic about the current functioning of the nuclear family. How is it related to neoliberalism and the late capitalism, let's say, all that?
Yeah, so, there's lots of critiques of the nuclear family that have been made, which are not necessarily related to our book, but there's things like, the sort of the privacy of domestic violence that goes on within the family and things like that. So the ways in which these forms of violence get enacted and just sort of get obscured from the public view. There's all these sorts of reasons why it's problematic. But for our purposes in the book, we're interested in the amount of work that goes on in the family. One key problem is the inequalities within the family, so that gendered division of labor, women continuing to do more work in the home than men. The other key thing, though, is the sort of massive duplication of effort that occurs by splitting, say, for instance, cooking into all these individual homes. Cooking could be done massively more efficiently, both in terms of time, but also resources, which are pretty important for things like climate change. You could do cooking sort of more collectively and have that as a bigger option. We're interested in the home, or the family rather, for its wastefulness of time and its sort of massive inefficiencies for a lot of things.
So why is let's say nuclear family so crucial for the neoliberal project? Why it is important to have it in the system? Like what brings it?
Yeah, Melinda Cooper's work has been really good on this, I think. So Melinda Cooper looks at neoliberalism within America and asks, what is the role of the family there? Why is the family so prominent in the discourse within America? And she points out that, well, actually, the family is essential to the neoliberal project. The key reason why is because if you're demolishing the welfare state and taking away all these public services, you need some sort of fallback option for a lot of these things. And the family is a massive source of unpaid labor that provides childcare and elder care and long-term care and does cooking and does cleaning and does caring. It does all of this work, and you don't have to have the welfare state there to provide it. So without the family, without the support of the family, neoliberal countries would just run into massive crisis of social reproduction. Who would be doing the caring? Who would be doing the laundry? Who would be doing all this stuff? The family is essential to neoliberalism, which I think goes against our usual ideas of liberalism as just being all about the market and individuals. But actually, this very conservative idea of the family is essential to it as well.
If we're talking about abolishing family or new concepts of how to do the childcare and all that, we are talking about communes and communities. I was just wondering, what is your take on this issue? Like, is this a alternative, or would you promote, completely different vision or system than communities or communes?
Yeah, when we talk about, alternative ways of organizing families and households and things, I think communes are one of the obvious examples of, what we might do. So in the book, we look at, for instance, the immediate post-revolutionary communes within Soviet Russia. We look at also the sort of massive commune movement in the United States in the 1960s in particular. So the sort of hippie dropout movement. The idea being, we reject all of existing society and we're going to, go and find our own ways of living and develop new ways of organizing social units. So we look at all of that stuff in the book, and I think a number of major problems emerge from them. One is they inevitably fail. They don't tend to last very long. Part of the reason why is because of a lack of privacy. So you get these communes which are sort of like, well, we've moved from the private household and we're going to get completely rid of any sort of individual privacy whatsoever. And you end up with, just sharing everything, and it doesn't end up being sustainable. I think more interestingly, though, the problem with a lot of communes is that they end up almost inevitably reproducing the same gender division of labor within them. So particularly in the 1960s communes within America, which were explicitly saying we're going to reject all of society's hierarchies and, ordinary ideas, and then they reproduce the gender division of labor within them. The only exception to this was the lesbian commune movement, which, for obvious reasons, couldn't do the gender division of labor in the same way. So there's much bigger sort of consideration of what is the most equal way of dividing up domestic labor within the lesbian commune movement. But it's a major problem with these things, is they reproduce these hierarchies.
Mm-hmm. Apart from communes and communes, you're giving a lot of historical examples of socialist post-work experiments. You're talking about Soviet Union, the early stage, let's say 20s, interwar Vienna, called Red Vienna. These concepts are related to your concept of communal luxury. Could you, tell us something about this concept of communal luxury and why is it important to this post-work imaginary?
Yeah, one of the main ideas we put in the book is this idea of public luxury or communal luxury. And it's an idea which I think originates with Mike Davis's writing in a particular essay. I forget what it's called. It's something like The Two Arcs or something. But in this essay, Mike Davis sets out, in the first part of the essay, the first half, is a look at urbanization and its negative impacts on climate change. How has the way we organize our cities, the way we've urbanized, how does all of that lead to climate change? And then in the second half of the essay, he flips it and says, well, here's all the positive aspects that we could pull out from how we've urbanized in order to deal with climate change. And a core aspect of dealing with climate change for him is something like public luxury, which for him is moving away from private luxury. So let's say, people having individual swimming pools and moving towards public luxury of big, luxurious public swimming pools. So really interesting, and one of the things we found in our research was in America, of all places, before about the 1950s, they had these massive luxury pools across the country. Pools where 10,000 people could come. They were like effectively mini lakes, surrounded by parks, surrounded by beaches, provided by local governments, and anybody could come and use it. This is a great example of public luxury. It ended up getting ruined in America because, of racism is a short reason why. But basically, they were desegregated at one point, and once they were desegregated, local cities decided they didn't want to fund them anymore. So these great luxury pools ended up just falling apart in America afterwards.
Can you give us some more examples of, good practice of public luxury and some historical examples that could be inspiring for us today?
Yeah, part of it is, for us at least, public luxury is partly an answer to the question of what do we do when we have more free time? And one answer is to say, well, we'll just go buy more things. We'll buy more commodities. We'll continue consuming. We'll continue feeding into the system which is killing the environment. Or we could start to build public luxury. We could have massive public parks. We could have massive luxury pools. We could have public libraries. We could have all sorts of public options for people to spend their free time in interesting and engaging ways that don't require us spending money, buying individual commodities, and all of that sort of stuff.
You're talking about this project in New York, which I always forgot the name of, this hotel from the 20s and 30s?
The Ansonia.
The Ansonia. Can you tell the public more, the audience more about this concept? Because I find it fascinating. So go ahead.
So we look at the family as a sort of source of one of the major reasons why we continue to do so much work in the home, because it forces all of this work onto the family. But along with the single nuclear family, we have the single family household, the architectural space which is designed to only hold a single family and not it doesn't enable any sort of alternative ways of living, at least in any easy way. And it's become, the dominant approach in many, many countries. The American dream of having a big suburban house that's, set off very distant from your neighbors and things like that. It's become a dream for a lot of people. And in the book, we try and look at what are some alternative ways we might organize our living spaces. What are some different ways that we could actually structure this material? So the Ansonia is a really interesting example, and it's part of this this movement of apartment hotels within New York. I think it was the 1920s and 30s, if I'm remembering correctly. But the idea of the Ansonia and these apartment hotels was it would be like a hotel, and that it would be sort of fully serviced. You'd have people doing cleaning and doing laundry, but it was an apartment, so you would stay there for a long period of time. It wasn't like stay for a few days. So it was this weird sort of hybrid between all these things. What's interesting about the Ansonia, well, a number of different things. One is that it was designed for the wealthy. And if you've seen, for instance, the TV show Only Murders in the building of that title is actually based upon the Ansonia, the real building. But yeah, so the Ansonia was pitched towards rich people. And I think this is quite interesting because there was this brief moment in time, at least, where even the wealthy wanted to live more collectively and communally. And these options were really, really popular with them for doing that sort of thing. The Ansonia was also designed for artists. So, for instance, the building was designed to be very, very soundproof. So you could be playing your musical instrument in your room and not be disturbing your neighbors and things like that. So there's all these little thoughtful processes about, well, how would we design a physical space in such a way that it does enable much more collective living and much more sharing of the care labor and domestic labor than what we currently have.
But if you're saying that it was attractive for rich people, does it mean that it was too expensive, or like these services were to live there or to get these services? It was too expensive.
It was expensive, but there were sort of more working class options as well. So there was a particular group of the Finnish immigrant community within New York, for instance, developed a little cooperative house that was very similar to these apartment hotels, but run by working class women, run in a very collective manner as well. So there's a whole span in New York in this time period of like very collective living, from working class situations up to these luxury situations. And it's just really interesting that the idea of the single family household is it's only one option at the time. And there's plenty of other options which are vying to be hegemonic.
Why does it end then? If it was so popular among rich people, what was the reason why it ended?
I mean, the short answer is the hotel industry killed it in New York. So you can see it in the name, apartment hotel. And it meant that legally within New York, it didn't quite cleanly fit under the laws for apartments or the laws for hotels. And the hotel industry really saw it as a threat and really didn't like these things. So they lobbied for the laws to be changed and effectively for apartment hotels to be blocked. It wasn't possible to build them or use them anymore.
When you're talking about some obstacles to, let's say, post-work society, you're talking about home ownership. Can you tell us more? Why is it, destructive for, developing the post-work society?
There's an amazing quote from a US developer in the 1950s, one of the biggest developers, house developers at the time. And he said that no man who owns his own home can be a communist. He has too much work to do, which basically sums up our entire book. It's fascinating. I don't think home ownership is necessarily a problem in itself, but the way it's been organized sort of is. You can see it in America, for instance, the rise of these massive suburban homes with huge lawns and things like that. And suddenly you have to take care of them. I can remember as a child, I used to live on a farm, and having to cut the grass around the farm took at least 2 hours to do every week. Huge amounts of time spent on upkeep of these big spaces. And it's all individualized onto the household, onto the family, to take care of this sort of work. The other sort of key thing that goes along with home ownership, and we look in the book at the ways in which America actively pushed the idea of home ownership out to other countries, particularly in South Korea, for instance, and Taiwan, I think, pushing this idea as a way to foster a sort of cultural force against communism at the time. So fostering the sort of individualism, this like self-reliance, this sort of emphasis on like building up your own project and like not worrying about anybody else. Really pushing for home ownership as a way to instill capitalist values in people across the world. It was an active project by America for a long period of time.
When we were talking about obstacles, maybe you could mention smart home technologies as well. Why do you find them problematic in many aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated by technology, so I sort of play with smart home stuff. And I mean, the big issue with smart home stuff is it doesn't do much. Like at best, you might walk into a room and your lights come on. Woohoo! Great, you saved me a second. They don't do much. The other key thing, though, is that they run into problems all the time. So, like, the amount of times that I have technical issues with my smart vacuum, which is actually quite useful, I have to admit. But, you know, it's constantly running into problems. It needs to be updated. It needs to be recharged. You know, the battery in it right now is dying. So every morning when I wake up and it's run around the house, it's inevitably stopped, like, under a table, and I've got to get under and grab it. Yeah, there's all these sorts of issues. It's like, you know, the home printer, all the problems that you have to deal with trying to get something printed in your house. Just imagine that for like 50 different devices, and that's the future of the smart home. It sounds terrible.
But when we are talking about technologies, could you, give us one example of a technology that reduced domestic labor, in a biggest manner, or how to say it? Like, well, if you have to pick one, what would it be?
I think if I had to pick one, it would be a sort of a cop-out because it's an infrastructure rather than a device. But plumbing, I think, is probably the biggest advance. In part because when you look at what living in a house was like before we had plumbing, the amount of water that had to be brought into the house and brought out, just a huge amount of work every single day, like people lugging this water on their shoulders and stuff like that. And again, if you look at poor countries around the world today that don't have plumbing access, most women's time is spent on carrying water around. And in fact, a lot of people think that, a key step for development in poor countries is get plumbing, get running water going, because carrying water around just takes so much effort and time.
So no smart home, but plumbing. It's nice. What do you hope the readers would take away from their after work? Like, what could be inspirational for them, in very, few words, very briefly?
I think the key thing is just that if you feel really busy at work and that you never have any free time, it doesn't have to be that way. There are reasons why you constantly feel busy, but there's also reasons why it could be different. And the book tries to set out, what might be some ways in which we could do that. Unfortunately, it's not a self-help book, so there's not a lot you can do as an individual, but collectively I think we can change a lot and try and make things better.
If you could give us a picture of your ideal, let's say, post-work society, what would it be?
I always liked Keynes's idea of a 15-hour work week. So there will always be work to do. We'll always have to do something which we don't want to do. But sharing it more equitably, reducing it as much as possible, 15 hours. So let's say you work 2 or 3 days a week, and then the rest of the time is up for you. But then we have systems designed to sort of facilitate people collectively working together on larger projects and, contributing to science and art and all sorts of different projects that we may not have time to do at the moment, along with fantastic public spaces to go and spend our time and enjoy, the sun and listening to people talk about books and things like that.
Yesterday we were talking about universal basic income versus shortening the working week, and the Inventing the Future you were talking a lot about UBI. And yesterday sounded a bit skeptical about this concept. So can you tell us why? What has changed? It's almost 10 years since it was published. So
yeah, in Inventing the Future, one of our core demands was for a universal basic income. In that time since then, I've sort of become a bit more skeptical of it, I would say. The core reason why is, well, I still like the idea, and I think I could theoretically imagine a world with a really nice universal basic income that was much, much better than our current world for everybody. The problem is, how do we get there? And I don't see a political force capable of getting a meaningful UBI passed in any sort of near-term timescale.
But by meaningful, you mean what? What?
Yeah, so a meaningful UBI would be something which, doesn't just demolish the welfare state in return for giving everybody a chunk of cash. It would be a significant amount of money, which meant that people didn't have to go and find a job, that they could survive without that coercion of having to go and find work all the time. Massively increasing the amount of freedom that people have. All of that sort of stuff, I think, is incredibly difficult to get, and I just don't see the capacity for it at the moment.
So why are you promoting the shortening of a working week instead nowadays?
Yeah, shorter working week, I think, gets a lot of the same benefits. Who doesn't want a 3-day weekend all the time? Although that being said, it's funny because when you have children, suddenly the weekend takes on a different sort of sense. You're like, I've got to look after my children now. The work never ends. But of course, when you have 3 days, you have a long weekend, one day can be devoted to sort of doing, your errands and things like that, cleaning the house. One day can be devoted to rest, and one day can be devoted to, actively, doing something nice with your children, which would be, I think, quite ideal.
Thank you a lot. Maybe we could also give a space to our audience a bit. If you have any questions, comments related to what Nick was saying, just raise your hand and you can ask anything. I don't know. Andrei.
Should I just shout? You can shout.
Do you hear him? Maybe for the record. I'll give you the mic.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much. It's a bit, maybe it's a naive question because my knowledge is limited, but I would be inclined to ask, how does ideas that you were just talking about and this issue of the domestic labor within the broader critique of labor as such in capitalism fare in, labor movements and like some contemporary, political forces that are like kind of headed in this direction, or maybe tackling the similar issues?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways in which it sort of interacts with labor movements. One is more and more labor movements are interested in so-called work-life balance. And I think implicit within that is all these questions about domestic work and things like that. The other key thing is that a lot of this reproductive work is increasingly done by people being paid a wage. It's being done in the market. So there's lots of scope for existing labor movements to organize these workers, domestic workers, workers doing, production of food and all sorts of things, to organize them and get them as a key part of the modern working class. In our book, we try and show that, the amount of work that's being done, that's reproductive labor nowadays in most economies, it's around 25 to 30% of jobs are related to reproductive labor, which is about what manufacturing was at its peak for many, many economies. So yeah, if we once had, this sort of factory worker as the ideal image of what the working class was, increasingly it's a reproductive worker and probably something like a home healthcare aide. That's the figure, I think, of the working class today. And that group, needs to be organized and, struggle for their basic rights.
So there's another question there. You have to go here, I guess.
Okay, thanks. There is another book on on labor published recently, which is called Digital Lethargy by who? You might not know about it. And he's arguing that the labor actually went on a heavy transfer from the traditional form into digital, which blends free time and actual working time, simply because the labor is organized digitally in the same way like the digital system. So then it's very simple to switch between working and non-working. And it also blends the working time and the family time and the home time. And so he's also arguing with things like idle mode, in which a lot of workers is basically all their working time until they receive a gig economy opportunity or something like that. So under this digitizing process, do you still think there is something like work time or something like family time or free time, or are these states so easily distinguishable from each other?
Thank you.
Yeah, really good question. I think you're absolutely right that they are blurred together. But it also depends on the job. I mean, as an academic, sort of my work is continually going on in my head. But when I worked in a factory, you know, when I got done, that was it. I didn't think about my job until I had to go in the next morning. So it depends on the job about whether or not there is this blurring of work as much or not. It is a problem, and I think, you know, France, for instance, has the proposal of you can't send work emails outside of set hours. And these sort of basic things I think are really useful in terms of reinserting that division between work time and other time, autonomous time. I think it's really important to push for as a struggle.
If nobody has any other question, maybe John. So John, please come here.
I arrived very late, so I'm sorry if you've talked about this already. But my understanding is that a lot of the discussions around like collectivization of domestic labor or reproductive labor also need to think about how we organize housing, and so that we more collectivized housing. But I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about whether our desire to live in nuclear families or our desire to live in single-family units is that just ideologically manufactured, or is it something that or what's the question? Like, what's up with that?
I know exactly what you mean, and yeah, you know, is the way that we live in single-family households with nuclear families, is it just the product of ideology, or is it something that we actively desire? And I think where a lot of communes have gone wrong is to think that it is all just false consciousness and that there is no actual desire for these things. I think people do want privacy, but I think the sort of idea that we try and put forth in the book is to try and bring together the values that people find in home ownership, particularly around privacy and being able to sort of do things with your own space and having some sort of, you know, not necessarily property ownership, but some sort of ownership and responsibility over your own space. You can do that in a more collective sense, like, you know, having collective laundries and various other aspects, and collective childcare spaces and things like that. So you can have private spaces for people where they can live private lives and enjoy all the benefits of that, but also sharing communal spaces for some aspects of life as well.
So maybe there's a space for a last question.
Regarding this talk about nuclear families, I've noticed, and I think it's really the last 10 years or so, that people talk much more about abuse in families, and there are a lot of people who cut ties with their parents. So I'm thinking that might be a factor.
Yeah. There's one study we came across in the book was something like, I want to say 15 or 20% of American families have somebody who's estranged in the family. So somebody who's just cut ties with the family. This is a pretty huge chunk of families that just are dysfunctional in very fundamental ways. So oftentimes, yeah.
That people are more
Aware of it.
not more aware of it, but more committed to solving that for themselves.
Yeah. So the families have always been dysfunctional, which is why it's always sort of problematic when you say the family will always take care of you, and if you're lucky, the family will. But for loads of people, particularly if you're LGBTQ or anything like that, then your family may not take care of you, and your family may actively not want to be around you, sort of thing. So, yeah, there's the family is problematic in many, many ways, which is why we need to build these alternatives of providing care, so that people do always have that sort of source of care in their lives.
Does anybody want to add something? Last possibility, option to... Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
I wanted to ask, because you said we can't really do much on an individual level. If there's something we can do on an almost individual level to start building functioning and efficient communities.
Yeah, so the reason why I say it's difficult to do on an individual level, I'll give the example of intensive parenting, which if you're a parent, you're probably aware of in some sense, even if you've never heard of the term intensive parenting. You feel the pressure from everybody around you, putting all these parents putting all this effort into their children to like do all these different hobbies, like learn all these different languages, learn programming when they're like 4 years old or something. You feel that pressure from the people around you. And you could, as an individual, say, no, I'm not going to partake in it. I'm going to let my child just sort of develop more naturally, have more free time. The problem is, potentially, you might be harming your child because every other child is going to be having multiple languages, coding, all this knowledge, and your child will be sort of left behind. So it's really difficult to step out of a lot of these systems without sort of actively harming yourself. Same thing with doing laundry. If you don't maintain the social expectations around laundry, then people think you stink, that people think you're dirty, people don't want to be around you. So again, it's an individual choice. It's very difficult. I think we can think about ways in which in our individual lives we might want to change it if we could, and we could think about ways we could design our houses better. And I think there's a load of space for architects, for instance, to reimagine the house. I'm not an architect in any way, so I can't do this myself. But there is, I think, a load of options for moving beyond the single-family home, learning from past mistakes with communal housing, and trying to build a future world that sort of reflects these ideas.
Thank you. So that was all of today's interview with Nickem Srnickem about post-work society, nuclear family, capitalism. Nick, thanks so much for your great insights. We are really glad that you been here with us today. Thank you.